Hey, and welcome back. So today, want to do a review on 6 different loaf pans, bread pans. Uh, After cooking with a bunch of these, we needed to get a few replacements and suddenly realized there are a whole lot of different options out there and some different surfaces, different bits of shapes and elements of how they're made and the style on them. So we chose 6 of them that we felt like represent some different points of view, and we'll go over what they are um, and put them to the test over the last 3, 4 months. Been doing a bunch of baking. My family's been happy with that. There's been fresh bread in the house all the time because I'm cooking once or twice a week with bread. So, been doing that for a few months. Have collected some thoughts, made a few notes. So, gonna give them a try. I'll be looking off to the side here occasionally as I set the notes down and kind of read them so that hopefully I don't forget anything that I've written down. First couple of things, some housework. Um, I won't be cooking anything on the show. You probably would not want to see me cook, and I'm not sure that I'm good enough to cook that I want everyone watching me. So, for those of you who have tuned in, maybe thinking that I'm going to cook something, probably no. You'll be a little disappointed in that regards, but hopefully you'll find this interesting anyways. All of the all of these pans are about the same size too. They're all about a 1 pound to a 1 1/4 pound loaf pan. They've all been cooked with the same exact recipe, about a 3 cup of flour bread recipe. Um, and they've all worked fine. Some are a little bigger, some are a little smaller, but the bread rose in to fill the dimensions of all of them. They all made a nice loaf. So they're a little bit different in size, but they all work relatively the same. Uh, and having said that, they all work perfectly fine. You would be happy with any of these. They work great. There isn't one of them that I would say, egad, don't touch that. There are some advantages and some pros and cons to each of them. Having said that, I'm going to give you 3 broad categories of loaf pans that, from my own experience, I wouldn't recommend. The first is the archetypical porcelain one that everybody gets. We got this, oh gosh, I'm dating myself, 25 years or so ago when we got married. Matches our plate pattern that we had for everyday use. Never use it. Nope, don't use it. Um, this sort of a glass, it's the same thing as like a glass and the porcelain. Looks pretty, looks nice, has a, no pun intended, a surface like glass on the inside, but stuff sticks to it. And if you use it for meatloaf, stuff really cooks onto it. Amazingly hard to clean sometimes. But the big thing is, it doesn't transmit heat worth a darn. These things are a huge heat sink. They take forever to warm up. And that's one of the downsides to some of the pans that we're going to talk about. The crown of the bread is exposed to much more of the heat and starts to cook as soon as you put it in the oven. But the body of the loaf, or if you're making a cake or something like that, the batter that is inside here takes a while to start to come up to temperature. And in the end, it becomes exceptionally difficult to modulate your temperature so that the crown of the loaf doesn't overcook and the stuff inside doesn't undercook. So long story short, glass, porcelain ones, they look nice. Sure, they match the patterns that you might have for your dishes. They don't work. Not really. Second one is the ceramic ones. Boy, that makes another nice tone there. Back in the 90s, these things became like the thing. We have pizza stones, but then of course you realized you couldn't put a frozen pizza on one because it might crack the thing. And we bought, rectangular baking pans. We bought a bread pan. We have muffin tins, all these other things. And, part of the thing with the ceramic was supposedly that there's a bit of a matte finish, and this is unfinished. Otherwise, there's no coating on it, so that it's supposed to allow moisture to migrate through the ceramic and give you a nice crust on the bread and that sort of thing. No, doesn't really work that way. Because of this matte finish, you got to oil and flour it, grease and flour it in order to get the bread to release. And by doing that, you seal in all the moisture. And it's just like the porcelain one. It takes forever to warm up. And by the time the bottom of this warms up, the crown of the bread has probably a little bit overcooked. It can be used, and you can see we've used this over the years. We've had this for probably the better part of 20 years. But we don't really use it that much anymore. It's one of those things that you wouldn't use it for meatloaf because you cannot get the stuff out of it. You have to be careful about cleaning it because some of the cleaning agents will get into the porous nature of it, and it takes forever to warm up. So again, interesting concept. It was the rage for a while. Everybody was like, wow, these things are great. Nah, not really. Lastly, the ubiquitous cheap as all heck metal one. We got a bunch of these when we first got married, my wife and I, and we've had some of these for, almost 25 years or so that we've been married. They work fine for a year or two, but these should almost be considered disposable. And the truth is, all of the ones that we're going to be looking at, the most any of them cost is nearly $20. The vast majority of them, and I'll talk about prices, they're around $10, $12 or so. These things are cheap. Don't get something so garbage like this. These, if you're going to cook something that, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out some reason. If you're going to like give it away with the pan or something, fine. If you're going to do something that was maybe going to like ruin the pan, okay, sure. But under normal circumstances, no. These, not only does the nonstick make it so that the food doesn't sort of stick to it, and these work pretty well when they're brand new, but the nonstick doesn't stick to the metal either. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. This stuff is going to peel off and start flaking off. I don't know if you can see that on this one here. It's even rusted a bit. This one's been sitting around, so in fairness, we haven't been using it for a few years. But the stuff starts to flake off. It gets into your food. And I got to be honest with you, I have yet to find a recipe where the taste of nonstick coating improves the item I'm cooking. Don't buy them. You only need 3 or 4 of them anyways. Don't bother. They're junk. And that brings us to the first one that we're actually going to review today. Bit of a dramatic pause here as I try to straighten something out. So, first one we're going to do, and I'm trying to make this so you can see it clearly, is a NordicWare Baking Essentials Loaf Pan. They're all essentially a 9x5, and that's the tag from it. And here it is. So the NordicWare is an American-made product. It is about-ish $9 or so, give or take. It's a nice enough little pan. I got this one because it's relatively inexpensive. Figured it would be a good replica for the absolute piece of garbage ones. Most people, this shouldn't be so far out of a budget. It is American made, kind of a nice touch as far as I'm concerned. And it's that darker color that gets some of the radiant heat. It's sort of a dark gray. It is a typical kind of stamped out thing. It comes with a 5-year warranty on the coating, and it is, of course, a non-stick coating like most everything else. We're going to talk a little bit about the coatings and how smooth they are. And this is one of those things that, obviously, I don't know exactly how to demonstrate this on a video. You'll have to take my word for it a little bit. But if you were to line these up next to each other and have you go over and just sort of feel the surface, any one of them you'd pick up and you'd go, oh, yeah, sure, that's kind of slippery. It's a non-stick. It feels good. But there are some real differences between one versus the other. And once you handle a few of these, and the difference between some of the best ones and some of the other ones is remarkable. It's a big difference. And it really matters when you get into the point of doing the cooking, especially if you're going to do, rather than a dough, if you were going to put a batter in something like this, a little more water content, a little stickier, bake it in that regards, it makes a big difference. They really are. One can be much more slippery than the other. This one is what I've come to kind of term, for lack of a better way to put it, dust in the paint. You know, if you've painted something and as it dries, a little bit of dust gets in it, and then you go back and you feel the surface of the paint. Yeah, it's smooth, things look fine, but you can feel little imperfections in it. Something you can't see, but something you can feel. That's what this is. It feels nice. It's decent. It's got a good coating. It's nice and evenly done all over the pan. There doesn't seem to be any thin spots on it, but there's a little bit of texture to it. Not a lot, but some. It's safe to about 400 degrees, which is relatively, higher. There's a few of them that go a little higher, but not bad. Again, it's made out of steel, but it's pretty thin. It reminds me a lot of the ubiquitous cheap ones. It's about the same sort of gauge metal, but it's stamped very nicely. It's all evenly done. And we'll talk a little bit about this as time goes on. There's always a little bit of a bead that is turned around on the top edges on these. And the idea with that is to be able to add some strength to it so that it won't warp. I would suspect the basic shape on these, it's a little box, a little rectangle. I wouldn't think this is so much in danger of warping. I suppose if you grabbed something and were the type of person who immediately to cool it off threw it in your sink and maybe poured some water on it, I guess maybe you could have some trouble with it. But in general, I would think this shape and size is more stable. But at any rate, they all have this little bead feature, and so we'll talk about that a little bit on these. But this one being a little bit thinner, I suppose the potential is there that it could have some issues. So some of the construction elements on it that are, I want to point out, has handles. These I really like. I've come to really like handles on loaf pans. The commercial one, which I'll show you for just a second, doesn't have any handles. It's just sort of it, and that's it. Now, if you were baking 30 or 40 loaves at one time, the space consideration, perhaps, you don't want to sit there and have to stack all these things in an oven, and you'll be able to get more of them in there with something like this. But having said that, I'm not cooking 30 or 40 loaves at a time. And when I have oven mitts on, these are a whole lot easier to grab in a hot oven. So I like handles. These have them. And they have a nice setup, they're large enough you can get a hold of them. And with the bead, you have a good little spot to catch fingers on or, catch the mitts on. So I like that. It's a nice design, nice element to it. Has a bit of a darker color, as you can see. And that works pretty well because it ends up, as you've seen on a number of recipes, sometimes they'll tell you if you have a glass, going back to the not transmitting heat, they'll tell you got to adjust the recipe. If you have a darker pan, you got to adjust the recipe. A lighter pan, same thing. This being a thin metal and a darker color warms up very quickly. And so the crown versus the inside, the body of the loaf that you're cooking actually works well in this. That is to its credit, a little bit of a darker color. Has a nice beading around the edge. I will try to see if I can get this in close enough that you can see that. It's a pretty substantial bead in there. And so you can really feel that pretty well. And even on the top, it's kind of stamped with a bit of a ridge there. So it really feels solid. You can't, when you try to flex this, nothing moves. So nice bead on that. And it also has rounded corners. Now, some places on the internet, YouTube videos, people will talk about how they don't like the rounded corners. They feel that that is a cheaper way of making it that is done because you're stamping it out rather than folding it up. And I imagine that's probably true. This is probably done with a die goes into a piece of metal, or the metal is folded over a die in some sort of a metal press. But, my opinion, the same mechanics that allow them to remove this from a die that's in here work the same way to have the loaf be released and come out. The rounded corners on it or whatever, and the angles on it, which everybody has a little bit of the angle on the sides, the bread releases and comes right out. It works really well. Let me show you as a quick compare and contrast with the commercial pan. Now the commercial pan is very much so squared up. And this is something that some people talk about. Aesthetically, when you get the bread out of this, you've got a nice square loaf. And I suppose if you were really worried about getting that last slice of bread out of it, being squared up and whatnot, this would make a difference for you. Really? I'm a little not sold on that one. The other side of this, and we'll talk about it when we get to this pan, is, because of the edges there, you also have a seam in there, a crease, that is something where food can actually stick in. And when all things are said and done, I can't imagine going to anybody and saying, wow, you did a great job cooking that loaf of bread. Tastes awesome, but I got to tell you, those rounded corners, seriously, no. The rounded corners work well for me because the bread comes out easy. And I kind of like the way that works. It's also easy when you get to the point that I tend to flour and grease before I put in the dough. The nice rounded corners, it's easy to do. Works well. So this is dishwasher safe, which is a nice touch. One of those things. Some of them aren't. Another convenience for it. I tend to do things by hand, but if you want to, it is dishwasher safe. So some of the pros about this one: it's lightweight, which means it's quick to heat up. The darker color captures the radiant heat inside the oven. So again, it's quick to heat up, especially when you're talking about the body of the loaf versus the crown. This works pretty well in that regards. It's a little bit of a larger size in terms of some of the other ones that we have here by comparison. Probably middle of the pack. And so that gives you a little more space for some things depending on the size of the loaf you're making. The handles on it, I really like that. It's one of only a couple that have that. And the cost on it, it's $9. That's relatively a good price for something like this. So as a basic, use at home sort of thing, not a bad piece. So what are some of the downsides? Well, nothing really a downside, but I guess maybe what are some of the things that you go, maybe it could be a little better. The surface is not as smooth. You can maybe let some of that go because of the cost, but the surface isn't as smooth. It is pretty thin, so I suppose the potential for warpage could be there. Like we talked about before, if you're going to throw it in the sink to let it cool down, maybe that's not the best choice with these. And it's a relatively short warranty. It's only 5 years. But all in all, I'll try to show you the tag here one more time. This is the NordicWare Baking Essentials Loaf Pan. And not a bad little pan. Works pretty well for what it is. Let's move on to the next. Since I've been handling this one back and forth, the next one I want to do is the commercial USA pan. This is also about a 9x5 by 2 3/4. This is a commercial bakeware loaf pan. This is the one that's all squared up, and I'll use for comparison as far as that goes. I'm going to switch my paperwork over here. This one costs a little more. As far as, other than the cast iron one, this is pretty much the most expensive one. It's about $15, $16. It's still not all that expensive. It's 9x5 by 2 3/4. It's, again, about mid-pack or so for size-wise. This has a limited lifetime warranty so long as you hand wash it. So I don't know what's limited. I suppose if you gouge the heck out of it or something like that, they're not going to warranty it. But basically, it's a lifetime warranty. For $15, are you really going to go and chase after somebody to try and get another one? Maybe. I suppose if you cooked a few times and it suddenly all started coming off, that would be something to contact them. But limited lifetime warranty, that's a nice touch. Made in the USA. It has a bit of a different type of coating on it. It's a silicone-based non-stick coating on it. And I gotta say, this is really good. So when we're talking about how smooth is the surface on this, this is perfect. It's like glass. It almost feels like it's already oiled. It's really, if you were to hold this compared to the NordicWare, you'd go, wow, that's really wow. This one is good up to about 450 degrees, a bit warmer than some of the other ones. It's made of steel, which is coated with an aluminum coating on it. So that may or may not be an issue. It's about the second thickest, pretty much almost the thickest metal of any of the ones that we're using today or we're going over today. And so with the aluminized coating, it's, as you can see, pretty reflective there. And why does that matter? Well, the radiant heat in the stove, this doesn't pick up so much. So, and with the thicker metal, it can take a little bit to warm up, but oddly enough, warms up pretty well. It's not that bad. It's made, instead of being stamped out, as we were talking about earlier, it has the nice square edges here. This is made by a piece of metal that is all contiguous with the bottom here, folded on the sides, and then, folded up, I should say, and then folded over on the sides. This also has a very heavy-duty ring around the top that inside the bead is, I should say, inside the bead, there is a ring of a I'm guessing, stainless steel wire. Doesn't seem to have rusted in the least for us. So this is remarkably stable. I think you could probably use this as a hammer on the spare time in your kitchen if you really needed to drive some nails. Very heavy duty, very solid. So a good thing. You can see why it's more of a commercial thing. You could probably, treat this a little rougher and not have to worry about it. So some of the special considerations or the construction elements. This has a fluted surface all the way around, which is designed to supposedly help with the baking, making it more even. I don't know. It cooked well, cooked really well, but I don't know that I would sit there and I'd say, wow, that really cooks so much better because of the fluting. It has the heavy gauge metal that is indeed nice and solid, but warms up really pretty quick. It transmits heat pretty good. Doesn't have any handles on it, which I think is supposed to be a space consideration thing, especially since it's all squared up and like so. If you had handles on it, it would probably be quite a large pan in an oven, but for what I'm doing, works perfectly fine. And as we talked about, has that folded construction on the corners. Now, the only downside to that, and I'm trying to see if I can catch the light on this, is these corners, there is a gap between the two pieces of metal, ever so slight, not a big deal, and I'm really being picky with this. But if you're not careful, again, I grease and flour whenever I'm making a loaf of bread. And dough is generally not so sticky that it's a problem. But if you're going to put a batter in this, if you weren't careful to make sure that you filled that seam with probably a grease, I imagine that food would get in there. It did a little bit with one of the batter type breads that I cooked in this. And nothing major, but it's clear that you've got to make sure that you tend to the edges here if you're going to use a wetter dough or a batter, because the food could get in there, and once it got in there, I imagine it'd be a little bit tough to clean that up. It's a picky thing, but it is one of those things there. This is hand wash only, doesn't bother me, but if you're wanting to just throw this bad boy in the dishwasher, can't do it. So some of the pros that we've been kind of talking about. The thick metal and the bead, this is remarkably stable. Going nowhere. Like I said, you could drive nails with this bad boy on the side. It's that good. The non-stick on this is superb. This is the best of all of the ones that we tested. Nothing sticks to this. I usually do coat the inside of it anyways when I'm doing bread, but I'm telling you, this thing works well. And the size on this is a bit larger, so you have some real room to put a nice big loaf, that you can make a nice big loaf on this. I did everything with the 3-cup, but you could probably make a bit of a larger loaf if that's something you wanted. Some of the perhaps downsides, it is hand wash only, which may or may not be something you want to see. The thicker metal does take a little more time to warm up. It can be on some recipes. You got to sort of think about the temperature a little bit, because the crown versus the body of the bread, this will take a little bit of time to warm up. And there's no handles, which is a thing for me. Maybe it isn't for some people because it takes up less space. So that's the USA Pan commercial bakeware 1 1/4 loaf pan. Moving on to the next one. The next one is a Gotham Steel Loaf Pan. going to try and get the whole thing in there. And this is, again, all about the same size, thereabouts. And this is one of the ceramics that are the copper ceramics that are very popular right now. And here it is. So this one is actually one of the more expensive, relatively speaking. This one's $14-ish, where I bought it. It's a 9 by 7 by 5 3/4 by 2 1/8. So this is about the largest pan out of the ones that we have. It's a really good sized pan. If you're going to make meatloaf, for example, something like that in it, you have a little more space to get in and get out of there. It has a lifetime replacement guarantee on it. They send you a bunch of information about it. I'll do a bit of a beauty shot here, try and roll it around a little bit so you can see some of how it's made and whatnot. The coating on it is a titanium and ceramic, kind of that copper coating that you see on almost everything nowadays. It seems like they put it on just about everything. And how smooth? This is really pretty smooth. It's not one of the not one of the silicone ones, so it is one of the sprayed on kind of texture, or there's a little bit of a grain to it, but it's really quite slippery. And I would say this is probably number 2 or number 3 in terms of how slippery it is. There's a little bit of texture to it. Occasionally you get a little bit of that dust in the paint type thing, but not much. This is really pretty slippery. This is good to 500 degrees, so a pretty good temperature. You can, if you wanted to bake something kind of warm. And it's made with a steel as the base, which is then coated with a bit of an aluminum coating on it, and then covered with the non-stick, both inside and out. This is about the thickest steel, even more than the commercial pan. So it's inherently a pretty thick pan and pretty stable as far as that goes. Doesn't have any handles on it, which, again, I won't go into that, but may or may not be an issue. The large bead on this, it really has, and I'll try to show that a little bit, really has a large bead around it, and it's fairly substantial. Has a couple of these little divots here in the middle, but you don't really notice those when you're working with it. It's really quite stable between the thick metal and the generous bead on it. And I suppose the bead's probably designed to give you a little bit of something to hang on to as well, because it is a fairly good diameter on it. It is dishwasher safe, so this is one of those ones, if you wanted to, you can throw it in the dishwasher. That's always a nice thing. So some of the pros on this, the thick coating of the nonstick material. This is really coated heavily and evenly. Everywhere you look on this, it's really coated well. There's no spots that are a little thinner, the change in the color in terms of the coating. This one is made in China, but they did a good job with this. It's made well, and the coating is really thick, put on there, done well. The large bead on it and the thicker metal should be more stable, and gives you a little bit of something to hang on to on the edges. The high temperature rating, if you wanted to cook something a little warmer, this would be the thing to do. The lifetime warranty on it, well, that's a pretty good thing. And it's a lifetime replacement, so that if there's any issues, they're supposedly just get you another one. Being one of those as seen on TV type things, I suppose 20 years down the road, 10 years down the road, will they even be around? I don't know, but the warranty's there. And it is a bit of a larger pan, so if you wanted something that was a little bit larger, give you a little more space to cook in, this would give you more space and does work out nicely like that. Some of the cons, shall we say, well, same thing that we had with some of the other ones. The thicker metal takes a little more time to warm up. The color itself is that coppery sort of brown, so it probably gets a little bit of the radiant heat, but all in all, just like this acts like the commercial pan in many regards. It takes a little bit of time to warm up. It's not that big a deal to adjust your time of how long you cook, but it does take a little bit of time to warm up. The surface itself is really pretty smooth, but not perfect. That would be, and I'm really getting picky with that. There is some imperfections occasionally, a little bit that you can feel, a little bit of that dust in the paint. And no handles, at least for me, that's a thing. Does take up space again, and the bead sort of is designed to offset that, but I might like handles on this. But that is the Gotham copper loaf pan. The next one is another USA pan one. This one is called the American Bakeware Classics. It's a 1-pound loaf pan. And this one is also made in the USA. Another, again, I like that. This one was purchased because it's their sort of homeowner grade one, shall we say, for lack of any other way to put it. Made by the company that makes the commercial ones. This is one for use at home rather than being the fancy commercial one. This one therein goes for $12, so it's less money than some of the other ones. And it comes in this sort of lighter gray coloring. The entire thing is coated with the Nonstick and has this fluted pattern on the bottom and a pretty generous bead across the top, as well as the handles. So you already know I like that. It is a stamped product, so you have those rounded edges. Whether or not, again, you consider that to be a thing, might be, but there it is. And it has a bit of that silicone kind of coating that is used on the commercial pan. So this is, strictly speaking, is an 8x5 by 4.5 by 2 3/4. A little bit smaller a pan compared to some of the other ones. Still within the same size frame, but a little bit smaller. Has that similar limited lifetime warranty in terms of replacement for it, and again, made in the USA. The coating is that non-stick and kind of a silicone one, and this feels very much like the commercial one. You feel nothing. It's perfect. It almost feels like it's oiled up even before you've done anything to it. I would say that this is the same sort of thing as the commercial one. It's very, very smooth. It's just perfect. If you put this next to like the Gotham one and ran your fingers on it, that one feels a little bit like dust in the paint. This feels like perfect. It's good to about 450 degrees. Is made of steel that has aluminum coating on it, just like the commercial pan. So reflects a little bit of the heat at first. The thickness of the metal is probably about middle of the pack. It's thicker than some of the other ones, not as thick as the commercial one, nor the Gotham one. So some of the special construction elements that I kind of like, well, I like the handles. These really have large handles, and the bead as well on the edge of the large handles. Even with oven mitts, you can really get a good handle on this. It works well. And you do have a really large bead for strength on this. And between the middle of the pack thickness of the metal and the large bead on this, this thing is very solid. You're not going anywhere with it. The fluted bottom is also supposed to help with cooking, allow things to cook more evenly. And I suppose probably in most things, if you kind of do something like that with a plate of metal, it tends to make it a little bit thicker or a little bit stronger. But mostly they talk about cooking. It's supposed to help with the cooking. It is dishwasher safe, so you can wash this one in the dishwasher, even though it has that same sort of it feels like that silicone kind of surface. I don't know why this one is okay, but the commercial one isn't. But that's what it is. Dishwasher safe. So the pros on this, it's very smooth surface. The coating on it is excellent. It's essentially perfect. Gives you an excellent release of food. Things don't stick on this at all. And the price, although oddly enough, is not that high. At $12, this is pretty down in the middle of the pack towards the low end of the pack. And for me personally, I think it's a decent compromise between the thickness of the metal, the stability, and the bead that's made on this. So the downsides, really on this, there's only one that I can think of. It's a little bit smaller a pan. So depending on what you're cooking, this will give you a little bit smaller volume. But overall, I really like this pan. this really works well. The next one, for those of you who know that I like cast iron, is the Lodge. And I guess it's a letter number combination, L4 LP3. I have no idea what that means. And unlike some other things, it says 4LP is stamped into the bottom of it there. I guess that's the number letter combination. So this is a nice pan, works well for some things. Other things, not so much. I've had this probably for 3 years or so. And you can see it has a nice enough, they have some handles on there. And the handles, I'm trying to catch the shine on this a little bit. There's a little bit of a lip here. It's angled a touch here on this so that it not only gives you something to grab to go to this hole, it's sloped in towards it, gives you a chance to hang on to it. It is an 8 1/4 by 5 and 2.75 in height. So this is relatively smaller too as far as size, not disproportionately so. The same 3-cup recipe, cooked just fine, but a little bit on the smaller side. There is no warranty specifically for the finish because as cast iron, there is no finish on it particularly. It's just for manufacturing defects, and you're not going to have any. Lodge casts things well. Made in the USA. Obviously, there's no coating, so you have to deal with whether or not you are comfortable with getting the seasoning to work on cast iron because it seasons the same way. How smooth is it? Not really. That's part of the problem on a certain level. After using this for a few years, I got to be honest with you, I don't really use it for bread or breads, anymore. This excels at pretty much, to me, one thing, meatloaf. And part of that is because cast iron really shines in bakeware, or using it for baking, pizza type thing. They make a pizza stone, I shouldn't say stone, but a pizza pan. That is fantastic. But this really works great because you can preheat it. You get this up to temp, you set it on your counter after you've made your meatloaf, you throw it right in, it can be sizzling as you put it in, it makes a nice crust on the bottom of it, and you throw it right back in the oven. Works fabulous. That alone is worth the entry price for this item. If you make meatloaf, and we do, once a month or so, this works awesome. This is fantastic for that. I know some people talk about it works great for making bread. I just have never been able to hardly get beyond the basic element of this is a heat sink. And this is even worse than glass and porcelain. You put this thing in the oven, and of course you can't preheat it when you're having bread rise in it, and the crown overcooks. Without going through incredible machinations about trying to keep your temperature really low for the first 10 or 15 minutes and then gradually raising it up. And by the time you heat up the metal and the body of the bread starts to cook, it's almost impossible, at least to me. Maybe that's my skill, so I'll take that ownership. But I have had a hell of a time trying to make this thing cook without overcooking the crown. So as far as bread goes, I don't recommend these. I know that there's some people who wax poetic about it, and good for them. God bless. I just can't make these things work. For meatloaf, though, these are fantastic. They work awesome. So this is a hand wash only, obviously. As far as the special construction elements, I'm trying to do all of my things. There really isn't any particularly. It does have some handles. It has a bit of a slope in towards these openings here, so it allows you to get a pretty good grip on it, which isn't bad. It's of course made of cast iron. It's really thick, really heavy. It is hand wash only, not the end of the world, but that's the way cast iron is. So some of the pros, it's durable. I mean, this is virtually indestructible. You would really have to work at it to ruin one of these bad boys. It works at incredibly high temps. You can preheat it and sear things like meatloaf, and that's where this excels. It's a little bit smallish, but it still has handles, and because it is pretty heavy, you really do kind of need the handles. And that's one of the downsides. It's pretty heavy. This is a pretty heavy pan. and it's a heat sink. To try and warm this up takes a long time. The price on this is also the most expensive. This is the better part of 20 bucks for one of these. You can get them in 2 packs and that sort of thing, but they're a little pricey as far as all that goes. And it's very, very difficult to not overcook the crown versus the body of the loaf. So that's the Lodge Loaf Pan. And the last one, thank you for those of you who've stuck through all of this, I hope I'm not boring you to tears, is a Calphalon Classic. It says Simply Calphalon Medium Loaf Pan. And it's a good little device, good little pan. So we have a bunch of this stuff is regular rectangular baking pans, and we've used them for a couple of years, and it works pretty well. So I thought, well, I'll buy one of these. Also, the brown texture of it, or brown color of it, helps a little bit with warming up and getting radiant heat. This is an 8.5 inch by 4.5 by 2.5 inch. So it's a little bit smaller in terms of size on it. Has a 10-year warranty on it, and again costs about 12 bucks. Made in China. The coating on it is a non-stick, but definitely some dust in the paint. It's pretty smooth, but has a fair bit of texture on it. Also for this one of the problems, and I do not believe I'm going to be able to make this go out, so I'm just going to have to, you have to take my word for it. When you look at the coating on this, you can see a difference in the temperature a little bit in terms of when they sprayed it on. Obviously, some parts of this are coated a little bit heavier than other parts. It's not entirely even on all of this. Safe to what temperature? I couldn't find any information on the tag that said you can use it up to such and such a temperature. It is made of steel, and then it's covered with the non-stick on both the inside and the outside. The thickness, it's about middle of the pack. The construction elements has no handles, but it does have a very nice sizable bead around the edges. So both for stability and also for grip. You can get a little bit of a handle on it, but it's not that big, kind of middle of the road or whatnot. It is about the smallest volume of all of the pans that we tested, but it is dishwasher safe. So if you wanted to, you could just throw it in the dishwasher. So some of the pros on this, it is a durable coating though, because I've used this with some other baking pans, and they've lasted quite a while, and they've worked out well. It's a pretty decent compromise between thickness of the metal and the stability, and cost. Works pretty well. And because the price is actually about the second lowest of all of the ones. So something that you can cut it a little bit of slack with doing all of that. Some of the downsides, the coating is a little uneven, and just is what it is. I suppose you can, it doesn't especially feel like it's missing anywhere, and I didn't have any great problems with cooking with this, but the coating is a little bit uneven. In some spots it feels a little more slippery than others. It has about the most texture, speaking of that coating, of any of the ones that we're looking at here, and is quite a bit smaller than some of the other ones. Let me show you real quick. With the copper pan, it really, I'm not trying to ding anything too badly here, but there's really quite a bit of size difference here. And you've got the bead on the edge there as well, so the volume difference is actually, there's probably almost, there's enough to slip your finger in there, and about almost half an inch on that side. So it's not bad. Again, the same 3-cup recipe was able to be used in this, but you get more of a crown on it. Depends on what you're cooking, but this is one of the smaller ones in terms of size. It has no handles, and I'm not really sure about the temp limit on it. So other things that are a little bit kind of a downside. But all in all, it's a decent enough, relatively middle of the road loaf pan. That's the Simply Calphalon Medium Loaf Pan. So Now that we've gone through all of that, thank you for any of you who have stuck through to all of this. Let me tell you how they rank as far as I'm concerned. In my 6th position is the Lodge cast iron pan. Nice pan for what it does, but I just can't really seem to make this work all that well with bread. The heat sink element of it just creates too much trouble. I haven't been able to crack that puzzle. But for meatloaf, fantastic. Works really well. Heavy, little more careful with the coating or the seasoning on it. You got to be more careful with washing it. Has a few downsides to it. So if you're baking bread by and large, this isn't what I would recommend because I haven't been able to make this work as well as I'd like it to. Number 5 is the Calphalon that we just looked at. I won't drag that out again. It's a little bit smaller. The coating on it's a little bit rougher. The price, it is cheaper, but not as impressive as some of the other ones. Number 4 is the NordicWare Baking Essentials. This is a good beginner or sort of home use pan, relatively inexpensive. The darker color does help a little bit with warming things up. There's a little bit of texture, the dust in the paint thing for that, but I like the handles, has a decent bead on it, a little bit thinner metal, so that also contributes to helping to warm up a little bit, but it's a little bit tinnier, cheaper as far as that goes. A decent pan though. If you're going to get a just you're not really into too much in the way of cooking, you want a relatively safe bet. Has a 5-year warranty, which is the shortest of any of the ones with a warranty, but I suspect this is probably going to work just fine for most people in home use. Number 3 is the Gotham Steel Loaf Pan. This coating is actually, for the ones without the silicone coating, is about the smoothest. It's heavily applied. The metal on this is a nice thick metal with a generous bead on the side. This one is large enough that if you had oven mitts, you could probably expect that you're going to get some grip on it because of the bead. But all in all, cooks well. The price is a little bit higher as far as all of that goes, but not outrageous. It's a decent pan, a little bit larger size, heavy-duty metal. It worked pretty well, but the thickness of the metal and combined with the color, which is a little bit darker than some of the lighter colored ones, I thought this would warm up quicker because it had a little bit of color to it. But in the end, when I started working with it, it didn't really happen that much. The ones that came in at 1 and 2, they worked as well as this did, but their nonstick was better. And certainly with one of them, it had handles, which I like. Number 2 is the commercial, the USA Pan commercial 1 1/4 pan. This is a really durable device for cooking. Works really well, but if you were going to make something that was a really wet loaf or had batter in it, these edges in here are a bit of a downside. I know, I'm being picky, but to me, the squared up aesthetics of it doesn't really matter. That's not so much an issue for me. I got one of these because I thought, well, I want to try one. The surface on it is superb. The fluted part on it, I really don't know if that makes any difference at all. It's a pretty heavy metal as far as the thickness of it. So again, very durable, but takes a little bit of time to warm up. So there is a touch of, when you cook with it, you got to make sure that you probably are modulating your recipe because of the body versus the crown. Overall, a very solid, nice piece, but a little too heavy in some regards. It almost gets in the way of heat transfer. But a nice pan, but pretty expensive in terms of what it is for it. So that leads me to number 1. This is also made by the USA Pan. This is the American Bakeware Classics 1-pound pan. So this is a bit of a smaller loaf, but not the smallest. So for some people, that maybe isn't the best thing. But for me, this turns out to be just about the perfect compromise between all of the sort of things. The metal's a little thicker, but not too thick. Has handles, which I really like, and a generous bead, which allows you to get a good handle on it. That is a really useful feature. The coating on it is the silicone one, which is superb. The coating on this is flawless. It feels like it's already oiled up now. The price on it's good. It's lightweight. It's easy to use. To be honest with you, this really is a great compromise between it. And for about the same price as some of the other ones, this is a pan that you can use for many years, cook anything in it. Yes, indeed, it does have the rounded edges, so maybe that's something to you. But otherwise, there isn't anything about this that I don't particularly like. This pan cooked well because of the thinner metal. It didn't get the radiant heat, but it didn't have any real problems with trying to match the inner part of the loaf versus the crown. And the handles and the finish, made in USA, limited lifetime warranty. I gotta say, that one is my #1 choice. They did a good job with that pan. So that's about it. If any of you, I know I've really gone on here long. If any of you have any questions or concerns, comments or whatnot, put them in underneath here and I'll try to get back to you, whatever. I appreciate the commentary that we've had on some of the other videos. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.